How we doing, folks? Excuse me, my chest isn't doing too good today. Program's really hammering into me. I went out the other day. This is just one little thing that they've done. As you can see, that little hole in that hat. This was a brand new hat. They had to just at least tarnish it, put a little fray on it, whatnot. But anyway, the point of this video is about genetics and the Rh negative factor, and I believe that I have a very, very strong theory, which I believe is pretty close to what actually is going down or what went down. The fact of the matter is, humanity as a whole, regardless if you're a human or a man, as there's different meanings behind these terms, but hey, the fact of the matter is, we're all quite mixed these days, and our initial origin, our inception, we were genetically modified. And no, we weren't genetically modified by extraterrestrials or any aliens or anything like that. We were genetically modified by humans who understood science, mathematics and physics and a whole heap of other stuff. They altered our DNA. They allowed a lot of our genetic code they wrote it so it's dormant. And I guess that's because they wanted to make us a slave race. And I believe this all comes out of Egypt or Kemet. We're black people. They were playing around with science. They wanted to make a slave race or social hierarchies within slave races. And I believe that's where these 12 tribes of Israel descend from. 12 tribes of Israel were 12 tribes with 12 slaves. And, you know, historians, archaeologists would have you believe that the out of Africa theory is correct and how we come from apes. That's bullshit. Yeah, the out of Africa theory can be true to a certain degree because, you know, Egypt's in North Africa. But, hey. So when they're coming after us Rh negatives, it's because we've got more active DNA. We're not slaves. We weren't bred to be slaves. We weren't bred to follow orders. Our genetic code doesn't allow us to follow orders. We give out orders. I'm not saying that I like giving out orders or I want to be a boss, but that is our genetic code, to be overseers. So Jesus Christ, Yeshua, was actually an incarnated being. He was awakened and came to give us the humans that have been tweaked, our genes that have been tweaked. He came to give us the teachings to activate our genetics, to activate our dormant DNA. Now, it's inside of us. All you need is the proper frequency to activate it, to come into play. And that's through the heart, through sacrifice, through unconditional love, to let you back in, to let you back into what you've been locked out of. They'll have you also believe that, you know, that it's an allegory. Yeshua or Jesus Christ is an allegory of the sun, the actual sun that rises and sets, and there's a 12-hour daylight. There's a cycle. That's just pagan sun worship. You know, I don't think there's anything wrong with the sun. I like the sun. It warms me up and it allows my food to grow. But I don't worship the sun. I appreciate it. The Nazarenes are real. Okay, the Essenes, they're real. They're a sect that have been around since the days of Egypt. They don't like to talk much. I don't know much about them because I'm not one of them, but I would like to be. Their belief structure is what I believe. And I also believe that the Nazarenes, or the Essenes, were also behind a lot of the other tribal religions that came out in that region. I believe that they were in direct contact with Muhammad, which I'm not going to get too much into because a lot of people just don't like hearing truths and they just get upset and want to hurt you, pull out knives and swords, and it's just the way of the world, just the history of the world. That's how it's always been. So I'm going to get some carbon into me. But anyways, so sorry I had to stop it while I had that cigarette. I know I shouldn't be smoking, but you know, being a prisoner in this home, not allowed to do anything, can't go out of my home. Being a financial prisoner, they have their ways of keeping you prisoner. They have their ways. And to the external eye, it just looks like you're a normal person existing in society. So anyway, I'll just continue what I'm saying. You know, this RH blood factor, sorry for touching my mouth, as you noticed, I do have not normal twitches due to what has been happening to me. I'm trying to get a hold of it and be conscious of it, but it's hard to be in control and conscious of every little detail in your life. It overexerts you. But anyway, you know, Rh negative blood types contain more copper in their blood. So if you want to look at all circuit boards and wires, a lot of them have got copper. They use copper. Excuse me. They use copper to make these wires because they're an excellent energy conductor. Energy can pass through it with minimal resistance. So if you're a human being with more copper in your blood, it means you're going to be more electric. And we do know that we do have these energy centers in our bodies that are, you know, commonly known as the 7 chakras, or chakras, as New Agers call them. But we have more than 7 energy centers in our body. I don't know. I believe they just keep opening up. I don't think there's an end. There's an end to them. I don't know, but I understand that there's a lot more than 7. There's almost double that's known, and I believe the more copper you got in your blood, the more of these energy centers in your body you can open up and channel it and fluctuate your energy through your body. However you want to take that, go look it up. We have, we're beings that generate bioenergy. Anything that's alive generates bioenergy. A plant generates bioenergy. So you can imagine what such a high conscious being, like a human being, could produce a lot of that bioenergy. Very, very powerful source. And I believe that's why they engage in sexual magic, because that's how you procreate. It requires 2 beings, in mutual union, engaging in coitus. And when they both reach a climaxal point of that bioenergy being released from their body, the being is created, which is amazing. But yeah, that's why they use this magic, because they tap into energy sources, which they're not allowed to do. And it's not because they want to be, the universal laws want to keep us in ignorance or out of these types of things. No, it's just because it fucks things up. If you're thirsty, if you're not thirsty, you don't drink water. So you need the water, so you drink it. It's the same with this manipulation of energy. And they just exploit it. But anyways, just to prove my theory on all this Rh negative factor stuff, and they say that, it's a lot of the pharaonic Egyptians had this blood type. And it can be proven because they think in the earlier dynasties they were depicted as blue and green. And that's because of the copper-based skin and the reflection of the sunlight. They'd look like a bluey, greeny, colour. And you go look at the Statue of Liberty. Go look at what metal the Statue of Liberty is made out of, and what colour is the Statue of Liberty. It's copper, and it's blue. I even have a copper bracelet on, and it sometimes leaves a blue residue around my arm. So I've proved that theory to myself. And if you guys want to look at the new Assassin's Creed game, it's also got a guy with a blue face depicted being carried around like an emperor. I will be adding these clips in this video though, if the program allows me to, because I've been trying to make videos all night and they just keep blocking it, messing around with the sound, screwing around with the picture, messing around with my applications, like my phones as well, blocking me on my phones, blocking messages from my phones from doctors, from hospitals, so I can't get medical treatment. I am really, really sick, and I'm just trying to remain positive and keep uplifted so I can maintain my momentum. Otherwise, if I fall down, I don't think I'll be able to get back up. Just gotta keep going.
Wir sind doch wieder ein so anständiges Volk geworden. Wir sind doch jetzt wieder ein so fleißiges und tatkräftiges Volk geworden. Was schaffen wir jetzt nicht wieder in Deutschland? Was haben wir nicht für Aufgaben? Man hat uns die ganzen Jahre schon eingeredet, dass der Deutsche sowieso nicht ganz gleichwürdig sei den anderen Völkern in der Welt. Was haben wir heute für Aufgaben? Was für gewaltige Werke bauen wir? Wir bauen heute die schönsten Straßen, gewaltige Anlagen, industrielle Art, neue Erfindungen haben wir gemacht, ungeheure Wohnhauskolonien, sie werden entstehen und sind bereits entstanden. Was wird nicht überall gearbeitet auf allen Gebieten? Wir haben bewiesen in diesen 3 Jahren, dass wir ein Volk sind, das bestehen kann vor den anderen. Und darum bitte ich dich nun, deutsches Volk, darüber gib nun dein Urteil ab. Der Welt unterstelle ich mich nicht, die kann mich nicht richten.
We're now on President Trump's visit to France to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. During a speech in Paris on Sunday, the president of France took an implicit dig at President Trump, who recently called himself a nationalist. President Emmanuel Macron rebuked nationalism, calling it a betrayal of patriotism and warning against old demons coming back to wreak chaos and death. Here in the U.S., there are signs that President Trump's nationalist view is in fact inspiring white supremacists and other fringe groups who spread hate. More on that right now from CNN's Sarah Seidner.
It was a meme for the midterms on a website visited more than 2.5 million times a month. Us if we lose, it read, depicting white men ready for war, followed by them if we win, showing Jews being led to their death.
They're begging their followers to go out and find ways to get Republicans in office because they believe it'll be easier for these policies to sail through.
There was a big day yesterday.
When President Trump celebrated the Senate victory, so did white supremacists. This changed history, neo-Nazi Andrew Anglin said on his site, The Daily Stormer, which is the most widely read neo-Nazi website in America. This is a race war, period. They also reveled in the re-election of Congressman Steve King, who has a history of making racist remarks, like in this 2017 anti-immigration tweet saying, "We can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies," or his unsubstantiated claim about immigrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border.
They weigh 130 pounds and they've got calves the size of cantaloupes because they're hauling 75 pounds of marijuana across the desert.
If last night was a referendum on Steve King's white nationalism, as the Democrats were trying to frame it, then white nationalism won, Anglin wrote on his site. Both King and President Trump vehemently deny they are racist or enable white supremacists. Trump pushed back at a recent press conference when asked if the Republican Party was seen as supporting white nationalists because of his rhetoric.
What do you make of that?
I don't believe it.
But purposefully or not, the president speaks a language racists and neo-Nazis embrace, like his habit of linking immigrants to crime.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists.
The Government Accountability Office says right-wing extremists are responsible for the vast majority of deadly terror attacks.
A German right-wing party is calling on Chancellor Angela Merkel to go amid criticism of her handling of the migrant crisis. Eurosceptic Alternative for Germany, or AfD, has described the government's approach as causing asylum chaos. The resignation call came during a party conference. This party co-leader says Merkel is standing up and saying that she doesn't know how many migrants will come to Germany. This is breaking the government mandate, the party claims, so she must resign. It comes as EU leaders set their sights on signing a deal with Turkey in Brussels today, a deal that offers Ankara cash and closer ties with Europe in return for help in stemming the flow of migrants.
I ask that General Business Notice of Motion number 1092, standing in my name for today, relating to anti-white racism, be taken as a formal motion. Anyone who pays attention to the news or spends any time on social media has to acknowledge that there has been a rise in anti-white racism and a rise in attacks on the very ideals of Western civilisation. I would also hope the Senate does the right thing and acknowledges it is indeed okay to be white. Such a simple sentence should go without saying, but I suspect many members in this place would struggle to say it. People have a right to be proud of their cultural background, whether they are black, white or brindle. If we cannot agree on this, I think it's safe to say any white racism is well and truly rife in our society.
Oh, wow. Senator Hinch.
Deputy President, I seek leave to make a short statement.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted for 1 minute, Senator
Thank you,
Hinch.
Madam Deputy President. With the federal election looming, I'm starting to think that Senator Hanson and her former colleague Senator Anning are now locked in a race to see who can be the biggest, the loudest racist bigot in their contest to see who can get to the bottom of the sewer first.
Well, it's not just okay to be white in Australia, it's actually a ticket to winning the lotto. It's a ticket to winning the lotto. Just look around this chamber, see how many faces you see that aren't white. Look, the reality is this "it's okay to be white" slogan has got a long history in the white supremacist movement, where both these clowns get most of their material from. You know what it's not okay to be in this country? It's not okay to be Aboriginal because you're more likely to die younger, to be locked up. It's not okay to be an African person because you're more likely to experience racism.
Order. There being 28 ayes and 31 noes, the matter is resolved in the negative.
The leader of the far-right group Patriot Front stalked his ex-girlfriend's new partner with tomahawks before setting his house on fire 3 years before launching his anti-Islam crusade. He was jailed in 2013 for a string of offences, including stalking, arson, burglary and damaging property. He sounds like a fine fellow. Anyway, he's in a video, he's learnt the error of his ways, he's had a bit of juice, so he's looking a bit bigger these days. And he's performing his little role as the little rat honeypot for the Australian nationalist movement. I gather you get this. Let's cut to the chase right now. He's been promoted on multiple television stations, the media, you name it, everywhere. Everywhere. This twat. We all know who he works for. Nothing comes from the mouths of these people regarding the political Zionist movement, Jewish power, Israeli intelligence activity. This rat needs to be outed. We need to find this rat, go to his house, film him, follow him, track him, trace him. I would put private investigators on him. I would investigate his full past, who he's working for, the police who charged him, who his lawyers were, who's advising him. You're going to find a rat's nest, a little rat criminal informant, drug dealers. I guarantee you he deals drugs. He's involved in drug dealing gangs. I already know the formula. All right, he's on probation. Part of his probation or parole is to play little white nationalist, white supremacist, quasi-nationalist group. That's who they employ for this role. He is just a cartoon cutout. Let's now establish the fact that Brendan O'Connell is the first case, 3 years in jail, multiple charges. It was a farce of a trial. You can get all my stuff right here on my blog with full transcript of trial and full High Court synopsis, which people who actually read it, which aren't many, say, my God, that's incredible work, with a badly broken arm, untreated, displaced fracture in a maximum security jail. Give me some damn credit. Sorry, but I want the credit, as Dustin Hoffman says in Wag the Dog. I want the credit. I bled for this cause, and to watch this puffed up little Decadurabalon, Sustodon using steroid twat get an ounce of credibility is driving me crazy. If ever there was a rat retard, it's him. So go to my blog, watch my latest blog post, Isolate but Preserve. You'll see the High Court case, what happened, what the...
Hey, this is Kim from Khan Academy. I am the History Fellow here, and I am here with Emily.
Hi, I'm the Biology Fellow.
So Emily and I are here talking about Darwinism. And I'm interested in Darwinism because in the late 19th century, we usually call the Gilded Age, there is a very prominent interpretation of Darwinism that is called social Darwinism. And social Darwinism wasn't so much an actual form of biology as it was kind of a misinterpretation of how natural selection and the theory of evolution worked that was used to justify or explain a lot of the social inequalities of this time period. And the way people often thought about it was that white Anglo-Saxon people, so Europeans, Northern Europeans, were kind of the most evolved. And this is our timeline of evolution from least evolved to most evolved. And people like African Americans or Asians or Native Americans or even Eastern Europeans were less evolved, that they were on a scale of evolution where they hadn't come as far as Anglo-Saxons. So, Emily, you're a biologist, and I would love to get your take on how it is that natural selection actually works and how this doesn't quite describe what was really going on.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe I can speak first to that specific graph that you've drawn. And I think that this is actually a common point of confusion when it comes to evolution, that there's not really such a thing as more or less evolved in evolution.
Okay, so this gradient really doesn't exist.
No, I mean, there's sort of I think that people sometimes see the pictures of like the ape standing up and turning into a person, and they think, oh, this is sort of a linear path from one thing to another. But what you really get is different types of organisms evolving from a shared ancestor and branching off. So,
all right, so
nobody who's alive on Earth today has been evolving for more or less time since their last common ancestor than anybody else.
So I'm going to draw what I think is how you're explaining this, and please correct me as I go along, but say this is my common ancestor, and then would there possibly be branches like this?
Yeah, that's a great way to draw it. And I mean, certainly humans are all extremely closely related to each other, but like we could even say this for us versus a dog, a bacterium, like pretty much anything. All life on Earth shares a common ancestor, and so that bacteria is just as evolved as you are, actually, in the sense of absolute time since those two split apart.
Right, so like from the moment that life first appeared on Earth, there has been so much time, and all of us have been evolving from that point. So even whether you're a piece of bacteria, piece a good word, a bacterium.
There you go. Beautiful.
Excellent. A bacterium. I took biology once. Or you are Albert Einstein. You have been evolving for precisely the same amount of time.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. Wow. I'm really relieved to find that I could describe that as well as I could.
You did a great job. Beautiful.
So you've done this this distinction between evolving from a common ancestor. So how is it that the actual theory of natural selection works?
Yeah, that's a great question. So natural selection, often people talk about it as sort of having 3 key ingredients. And to see how it works, let's imagine that we're just looking at a population of beetles. So picture your beetles to start with. And what would we need to have in order for these beetles as a group to evolve by natural selection? So one thing that we would need is we would need some variation among the beetles.
Okay.
So if you have identical beetles, you're not going to have any that are better at surviving or reproducing than any others, which is kind of a key ingredient for what we're going to talk about.
Okay. So I've got 2 different beetles here. They're slightly different from each other.
Awesome. And you've made them different colors, which is perfect. So we have variation, and the next ingredient that we're going to need is we're going to need that variation to be heritable. So we're going to say that those beetles, one of them is green and one of them is blue, and that's because of something in their DNA. So they have differences in their DNA that create the variation in colors.
Okay. Oh, right. So when you say heritable, you mean that this is something that their descendants could inherit?
Exactly. That is exactly it. So the final ingredient is that the differences, these heritable differences, need to affect how good the beetles are at leaving offspring in the next generation.
Okay.
So, for example, let's say we would probably have more than 2 beetles in our actual population, but let's say this population has just moved into a new area that is very blue colored.
Okay.
So blue rocks, blue flowers, whatever. And there's also a bunch of birds in that environment that really like to eat beetles. And I'm guessing that if they have blue beetles and green beetles, that one of those is going to show up a lot better against the blue environment than the other. So probably a lot of our green beetles are going to get picked off by birds, and they're not going to be able to leave offspring because, gosh, they kind of got at. So when you look at the next generation of beetles, if we know that the colors get passed on, we're going to probably see a bigger group of that, a bigger proportion of that group being made up of blue beetles and less being made up of green. And that is an example of natural selection in action, where you can see that organisms that survive and specifically reproduce better in a certain environment are going to increase in frequency in a population. So you're going to get more and more of these blue guys, less and less of the green guys.
Is there a word you would use to describe this this adaptation? Is that the natural selection part, as from variation and heritable? Like the natural selection is just like a good situation?
Yeah, I mean, natural selection is really the differential survival and reproduction.
Okay.
And as you mentioned a great word there, which is adaptation. Mm-hmm. So adaptation is the word that biologists often give to the process of a population getting better and better suited to its environment. So you would say that the population was adapting to being in a blue space. Mm-hmm. As it gradually started to have more and more blue beetles across generations.
So what I find really interesting about this is that it's entirely by chance, right? More or less, you've got a genetic mutation, and then that mutation happens to suit the environment that you're in, which allows you to thrive, and your genes and your adaptations to be passed on over time.
Yes, and I mean, the variation would have occurred randomly to start with. Like you say, it would have been a mutation. It didn't happen because the beetles went to a blue place and said, gosh, I should be blue. That would be awesome. That was not what happened. It was already there, and it just happened to be successful in that environment. And if they'd gone to a green place, well, guess what? You would have gotten exactly the opposite effect. Suddenly the green guys would have been more successful, more able to leave offspring, and you would have seen green be increasing or, quote unquote, favored by natural selection.
In 1786, a guy named William Jones gave a speech that essentially founded the modern field of linguistics. Unfortunately, that same speech was instrumental in creating the idea of an Aryan race. Jones's speech is known today for proposing the existence of the Indo-European language family, the idea that most of the languages of Europe, Iran, and the Indian subcontinent are all variations of what used to be one single language. But at the time, it wasn't clear what to call this language family. Indo-European eventually became the standard, for obvious reasons, but some people wanted to call them the Japhetic languages after a character from the Bible, and some people in Germany wanted to call them the Indo-Germanic languages, because of course they did. But some people noticed that at least some of the authors of ancient Sanskrit texts called themselves Aryans, and from there inferred that the original Proto-Indo-Europeans also called themselves Aryans, and thus they preferred to call it the Aryan language family. At the same time that people were fighting over what to call this group of languages, people were also arguing about what the nature of this grouping was exactly, and some pretty weird ideas were getting thrown around. Now, what I'm about to describe will make a lot more sense if you think about the intellectual climate of the 1800s. It hadn't been that long ago since the Enlightenment had called into question the literal accuracy of a lot of biblical narratives, and science was in the process of suggesting a lot of new ideas about the history of the world and the origin of humanity. But at the same time, the out-of-Africa theory for the origin of humans and our modern understanding of our evolution from chimpanzee-like ancestors was still a long way off. Mix all that uncertainty together with the idea of an Aryan language family, as well as a big old heaping of racism, anti-Semitism, and nationalism, and you get some weird ideas. Ideas like, maybe the original speakers of Proto-Aryan were white people, and all white people are descended from those original Aryan people, and that's where white people come from. Maybe those Aryans conquered India, but then interbred with the native black population, and that's why modern Indians have brown skin. Maybe this sacred Indian religious symbol was actually a symbol of those ancient Aryans who invaded India. Maybe Aryans interbred with other races in Europe too, but who interbred with who and in what ratios produced all of the different modern European nations, except Germany, which is the only place where there are still pure Aryans. Maybe Jesus, even though he was born to non-Aryan Semitic language-speaking Jews, was miraculously an Aryan, because miracles. Maybe Christianity actually has nothing to do with Judaism and is actually a direct descendant of Germanic paganism and is a pure Aryan religion. Maybe we should get rid of the Old Testament because it was written by Jews, and maybe the entire Catholic Church is just a Jewish conspiracy, and so is communism, and so is capitalism, and so is everything! And you can probably see where this is going. Now, we're talking about a lot of different people over the span of more than 150 years who were all toying with ideas like this, and they disagreed with each other a lot on the specifics, but these were the kinds of ideas that were being thrown around in the century leading up to the Nazis. But before I talk about them, I'd just like to point out that the whole idea of an Aryan people ancestral to Europeans never made much sense to begin with. Remember how some Sanskrit speakers called themselves Aryans? Well, for one thing, it was only ever the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-Europeans who called themselves that. None of the others did, which makes it look a lot more like this was an innovation of one branch and not something that can be traced back to the root. For another thing, even at the time, they used it more as a sort of cultural signifier to refer to anyone who spoke the language and practiced the Vedic religion. Loads of people in the Vedas are called Aryan even though they clearly have non-Indo-European names, so they obviously didn't think of it as some kind of racial category. Alright, now let's talk about how the Nazis used the word, which is to say, surprisingly little. Like, they did use it, and today we might associate the Nazis with the term very strongly, but for a lot of their purposes, the word was just too inclusive. On one hand, Nazi academics really didn't like it because it referred mostly to a linguistic group, and they knew perfectly well that connecting language to race was not straightforward. Besides, if anyone who spoke an Aryan language was an Aryan, then that would include German-speaking Jews, and they couldn't have that. They preferred to use more specific terms like Nordic race or German people. On the other hand, there was Nazi propaganda aimed at the masses, which used Aryan a fair amount more, but still not nearly as much as I thought it did when I started doing research for this video. Mostly they used it in a vaguely pan-European sense, but in a way that specifically excluded Jews. The usual spiel went something like, Aryans are responsible for everything good that ever happened in history, Jews never did anything useful, and that's why Jews suck. Maybe the most ridiculous example of this is how they used it in a legal context. Two laws from 1933 literally defined non-Aryans as anyone with at least one Jewish grandparent. Funny thing though, the Nazis mostly stopped using the term Aryan in a legal context after 1935 because of those objections from academics. As far as I can tell, neo-Nazis actually liked the term Aryan way more than Nazis ever did, and for the same reason, Aryan has pan-European connotations. That fact made Nazis kind of hesitant to use it, since remember, they were German nationalists who really hated French and Slavic people. But it makes modern white supremacists love the term, especially in the US where most white people have ancestors from all over Europe. So besides neo-Nazis, the word is still used in a couple other contexts today. The word came to mean something like noble or honorable in India, and is still used there, mostly in religious contexts. Meanwhile, in Iran, the word developed more specific ethnic connotations and eventually morphed into the modern word Iran. Linguists mostly stopped using the term to refer to language, with the one exception that they still use the term Indo-Aryan to refer to a family of Indo-European languages centered around India. Besides that, they felt a strong desire to distance themselves from the word, for obvious reasons. Thank you, patrons. Here are some sources. Bye.
sini bang, sini. Udah.
Pak, kau dengar? Woi, saya tunggu doamu itu. Melaksanakan perintah negara. Ya, jelas. Hei, anjing siapa? Woi, jam tangan, jam tangan. Hei, Pak jelas. Jam tangan kamu. Kau. Jam tangan bakal. Kau. Jam tangan bakal. Bajingan. Kau. Jam tangan bakal. Bajingan. Sama lagi. Kalau mau buka, kalau mau buka kalau mau. Itu masih berdarah hidup, Bos. Kami tidak akan berdosa.
Jangan nomor orang me ni don nari aku bisa peluru ni nebe jarak me tuh nggak merah ni nomor nggak merah karena nggak juga nggak penggari bukan niga jangan lagi kini nomor jangan biu.
They teach us about the genocides of Europe, but what about the genocide in the Pacific? Papua, one of the richest resource lands in the world, and home to the native Papua people. Why was this land split in half and given to Indonesia? The Indonesian army has murdered over 700,000 native Papua people. By United Nations definition, that is genocide. This is the genocide of our Pacific brothers and sisters, and it still continues today. This is the history relevant to me. This is the history they don't teach me at school. In the 17th century, Netherlands took control of the region of West Papua and Indonesia. They found West Papua extremely rich in resources. The rainforest is the second largest in the world, and they found mountains containing huge deposits of gold. When Indonesia gained independence, they also demanded they have West Papua. The Netherlands said no. Papua people are ethnically different, and West Papua should be for them only. So to avoid war, they transferred the land to the United Nations. Meanwhile, American companies had sent geologists to West Papua to check out these mountains of gold. Lo and behold, the deposits were huge. So much so that the largest gold mine in the world today is in West Papua. So America began a campaign to make Indonesia happy. They supplied them with weapons and pressured the UN to transfer West Papua to Indonesia. And so, the United Nations supervised a vote to be held. Do the people of West Papua want to be ruled by Indonesia? Or do they want to be free and independent? In a population of 1 million people, only 1,000 Papua men were chosen to vote. They were chosen by the Indonesian army, and the vote was held at gunpoint. And guess what the United Nations called this event? The act of free choice. Ever since, the Indonesian army has murdered over 700,000 native Papua people, mutilated and tortured them, gang raped Papua women and children, destroyed hundreds of villages, and taking selfies with murdered leaders like animal trophy hunters. It is extermination, and the world's media are not allowed into West Papua. In West Papua today, it is illegal to sing traditional Papua songs. It is illegal to dress in traditional Papua attire. It is illegal to raise the Papua national flag. It is illegal to be Papua. America continues to sell weapons to the Indonesian army, train their soldiers, and steal West Papua gold. Australia and New Zealand give nearly $1 billion in aid to Indonesia. They are all part of this genocide. The next time you think about holidaying in Bali, think about if your money is being used to murder our Pacific people. Our Pacific histories are intertwined. We are one Pacific people. If they ever found gold in Samoa, you bet they'll be killing us too. This is the genocide of our Pacific brothers and sisters that continues today. It is time to fight for our freedom. This is the history relevant to me. This is the history They don't teach me at school.
This is the week when, for many, trauma became terror. When Rohingya refugees who'd escaped so much violence were shocked to learn they might be repatriated to Myanmar.
I've been crying because of how sad I am that we might be sent back. Our relatives were killed in Myanmar. We were all persecuted there so much. We came here to Bangladesh to find peace. This is a peaceful country, but we're not at peace because we've been told we are on a list.
That list is the reason there's so much fear in this place. It includes the names of thousands of Rohingya refugees who've been chosen as candidates to potentially be sent back to Rakhine State as part of a deal between the governments of Bangladesh and Myanmar. Minyara Begum tells us her camp leader informed her that she and her 3 children are on the list. But she says they'd rather die than return.
We drink poison before we go back to Myanmar. If it looks like they will try to move us, my children and I'll buy poison from the market here and we'll drink it.
The government of Bangladesh insists repatriations will be on a voluntary basis only, but Minyara is not convinced.
The atmosphere